I guess, talking about, personal injury, obviously, Ted, that's what we do. One of the questions that I usually get from my clients, they're asking, tell me about my insurance policy. And you know how somebody comes in and they say, well, I got full coverage.
What does that mean? Because I believe that full coverage means something different for everybody. Is that true, or do y'all see that in your practice?
I think a lot of people, when they use the terminology full coverage, I think it gets thrown out with agents at times, and typically that means the bare minimum coverage that you're required to have under the state of Florida regulations, which is quite frankly pretty minimal. All the state of Florida requires is that you have $10,000 worth of property damage liability coverage to protect if you hurt someone else's vehicle, and then the PIP no-fault benefits that we've always discussed that provides $10,000 of essentially built-in health insurance on your own auto policy. But Les, when we ask that question of people and they tell us full coverage, that's not what they're thinking about whenever they say that, is it?
No, they're thinking that if I'm involved in a wreck, whether it's my fault or somebody else's fault, I've got an insurance policy, and that policy is going to provide whatever coverage I need, and it's going to compensate me whatever I need in order to pay my bills, to reimburse me for lost wages, pretty much everything. When people hear full coverage, they think, well, I've got full coverage. And like Ted said, full coverage in the state of Florida, also basic minimum coverage is $10,000 of property damage liability coverage. So if you hit somebody's car, $10,000 will go to either fix or total that vehicle out. I don't know if what y'all been seeing in terms of used car prices and new car prices, but $10,000 probably won't even get it through a car wash these days because of the cost of new vehicles. And so when you start looking at your minimum levels of insurance, what it takes to be legal to drive on the road, there's really not a lot of protection there if you cause a wreck. Now, if you cause injury, the state of Florida right now doesn't even require bodily injury liability coverage. That's an extra type of coverage you have to buy. And so what we always tell people when they come in to see us and they say, hey, what are my rights? What are my obligations? What can I do to help better protect myself and my family? We always talk about uninsured motorist coverage. And I know we've talked about that, beat it like a dead horse on this show over and over and over again, but it's because it's so important. Just this last week, had to tell somebody that, hey, look, you were involved in this wreck. The person that hit you doesn't have any bodily injury coverage. You did not elect uninsured motorist coverage. Therefore, the only benefit that injured person had was the $10,000 in PIP benefits. And similar to new car prices and used car prices, go check out what a bill from the emergency room costs. If they do a couple CT scans, you'll find that $10,000 goes away pretty quickly. So, when you start talking about full coverage, be a little bit more inquisitive with your agent. Ask them what that actually means, and then talk about what your needs are so you make sure you protect yourself.
Right, and that's a very difficult conversation to have with clients, and they're like, well, they're responsible for all of my medical bills, no matter what they are, and trying to explain the limits of liability. For example, in Les's example, that individual didn't have any insurance, and sometimes they only have $10,000 of coverage, or $25,000, let's say, for example, and it can be a case where there's either a death or very significant injury, and the medical bills are tenfold that. And the problem is yes, the person that hit you is responsible for that, but they have to have the capability to actually pay that judgment. And in the state of Florida, there's several protections that prevent you from collecting against most W-2 wage earners, because your homestead is always going to be 100% protected from a liability claim. And if you're a wage earner, typically you're not going to be able to garnish those wages if you're the head of your household. So in a practical sense, if there's not insurance coverage on the other side, and if you have not protected yourself with coverage, then there's not going to be an avenue for you to recover those bills. So it's important to protect yourself and make sure that you can weather the storm if some significant accident happens to you.
Yeah, and hopefully we're going to see some changes. I know in the last few years, the Florida legislature has had bills presented. I think it passed the House and the Senate last year.
Yes.
It ended up being vetoed by Governor DeSantis, but it was a mandatory bodily injury liability bill. And what that was it was going to bring Florida in line with pretty much every other state in the country in terms of requiring people to have a minimum amount of bodily injury liability coverage. It's really a shift away from what we call the no-fault system, when you hear the term no fault, what that really means is that's your personal injury protection. No fault means your own insurance is going to pay a medical benefit for you, and the other person is going to pay for them, regardless of whether it's your fault or somebody else's fault. Now, even in a no-fault system, you can still bring a liability claim against the person that caused the injury or the accident. And when you do, you're typically looking at their bodily injury liability coverage. Well, every state in the country except for I think 2, Florida and one other, and I think it's Vermont or New Hampshire, it's somewhere up in New England, does not require bodily injury liability coverage. And so, you know, if you're going to get in a wreck in Bay County or Jackson County, Washington County, anywhere in our listed area, chances are you're going to get hit by somebody that doesn't have insurance or doesn't have enough insurance to fully compensate you, even for some basic medical treatment. And if you have to miss a few days from work, you really need to pull your policy out, take a look at it. You're looking for bodily injury liability coverage. You're looking for uninsured motorist coverage. If you have those, then you're going to be much more protected than the average person out there on the road.
Right, because as Les said, in our state of Florida, listen, there is not mandatory insurance. But for example, where we have some stations down in Alabama, there is a mandatory $25,000 of liability coverage, and I believe there's also mandatory limits in Georgia as well. Les, I know you practice there. Do you know what those limits are?
They're the same. They're 2550. That seems to be pretty much the standard. And when we say 2550, what that means is $25,000 per person making a claim, $50,000 per occurrence. And so there's a per person limit, there's a per occurrence limit. So when you start talking about the per occurrence limit, if there's one person in the vehicle, you know, they're going to get that single policy limit benefit if they need it. If there's 2 people, then they will each get that single person liability limit if they need it. But if there's 3 people in the vehicle, now you get into a situation where you have what they call multiple competing claims. You have multiple people competing for a limited amount of insurance. And if you ever find yourself in a situation like that, the absolute first thing you need to do after you take care of your medical needs is you need to talk to a lawyer, because those situations can get very tricky. Insurance companies have an obligation to do certain things, especially in the state of Florida, and having an attorney that understands the Florida liability laws, the automobile insurance laws, having an attorney that can help you navigate that is going to be very much to your benefit.